I want you to think of a philosopher, a generic philosopher, okay? Picture what a philosopher looks like in your mind. What does he look like? How does he act? He's probably old, balding, or at least a little gray, maybe a bit stooped. Perhaps he's a bit more professorial, bearded with glasses and a long nose. And in your mind, what's he doing, this philosopher? He's sitting at a desk, right? Either reading or writing. Perhaps if you imagined a Greek philosopher, maybe he's sitting on a rock speaking with a crowd of other philosophers. But when we think of philosophy and wisdom and learning, this is what we think of: bald heads and quiet contemplation. Which is why I want to talk about someone you've never heard of, Francois de la Rochefoucauld, a famous French writer and philosopher who lived in the 1600s. And that's because Rochefoucauld was not only a man of letters, but a man of action as well. This is someone who wrote one of the great works of the Western canon, but also literally kidnapped the Queen of France and smuggled her out of the country. His writing and his wit made him the star of the literary salons of Paris, but he also killed people as a cavalryman and was himself both shot and stabbed in battle. And I think his dual nature is demonstrated quite well by comparing a history that he wrote with what actually happened, okay? He wrote a history of a civil war in which he was involved. And the history is, what you would expect: serious, solemn, dry, stately. One biographer of Rochefoucauld writes that no one would suspect that the historian who affects the gravity of Tacitus was acting all through the events he describes with the levity of a full-blooded and unscrupulous schoolboy. The most amazing instance of this is his grotesque attempt to have his enemy, Cardinal de Retz, murdered at the Palais de Justice. In the course of a sort of romping fray, he caught Retz's head between the flaps of a folding door and shouted to his friend Coligny to come and stab him from behind, but he himself was shoved away and the cardinal released. La Rochefoucauld admits the escapade without any sign of embarrassment, merely observing that Retz would have done as much by him if he had only had the chance. Okay, so this philosopher is, at least in his early years, a sort of brawling gangster who tries to carry out mob hits on his enemies. This is a man who, in his lifetime, tried multiple times to overthrow the government of France and nearly succeeded. He carried on multiple affairs with extremely high-ranking women. He was an experienced cavalryman. He's constantly smuggling people in and out of France in these intricate plots that resemble a heist movie. He just lived this wild, interesting, colorful life and used that rich life as the basis for his later career as a philosopher and man of letters. He was a great soldier, schemer, and courtier, but also a truly great writer, and it is his writing that forms the greatest part of his legacy today. His book Maxims is a series of 504 short aphorisms about people, the way we are, what we do, and why we do it all. It's one of the great works in the French language and served as a major inspiration to many other philosophers, most notably Friedrich Nietzsche, who used it as a source extensively. So today we are talking about the life of Francois de la Rochefoucauld, both what we can learn from his wild and interesting life and what we can learn from the philosophy that was born from it. Welcome to How to Take Over the World.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
This was our finest hour.
I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to take this chance to apologize to absolutely nobody.
Hello, and welcome to How to Take Over the World. This is Ben Wilson. I don't have a long introduction for you today. I'll just say that this episode is based on the excellent work, the Delphi Complete Works of Francois de la Rochefoucauld, which includes translations of all Rochefoucauld's works, including his memoirs, as well as a few 19th century biographies of the man. And look, if you're listening to this, you're a real fan. I appreciate you. You saw an episode about a guy you've never heard of with a long, complicated name, and you still press play because you trust me. And so I just want to say thank you. I see you. I appreciate you. You're the real fans. And I think you'll be well rewarded for your trust. So, hang in there. This is going to be an unfamiliar story for the vast majority of people listening, but I think that you're going to get some really great takeaways. I got some really great takeaways, and I learned a ton from this. So with that said, let's get into it. This is the life of Francois de la Rochefoucauld. But first, a word from our sponsor, Gains in Bulk. Creatine is the best and most tested supplement in the world. Countless studies have showed its positive effects on muscle growth, yes, but also recovery, endurance, and cognitive performance. That's why it's the only supplement that I take every day. And Gains has the best creatine. They have instantized creatine, which is fully water soluble, making it more bioavailable, so you get more benefit without the bloating and water retention that other creatine can cause. I really think this is the rare case of a supplement being truly differentiated and better than the competition. So check it out at gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN for 20% off. Again, that is gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN. And use code BEN. And use code BEN for 20% off. Again, that is gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN. Again, that is gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN. 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 Okay, so Francois is born in the early 1600s, 1613 to be exact, into one of the most aristocratic families in all of France. They have like a perfect aristocratic record. They have dukes going way back, extensive land holdings, great reputation. They're really well known and very aristocratic. Their dukedom, their territory is in Aquitaine in southwestern France. So he's born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but also metaphorically with a dagger in his left hand. He gets a typical aristocratic education, which at the time means more manners and military training than literature and mathematics. But as soon as he comes of age, he begins intriguing against the French government. And the cause of this is that the government of France was rapidly changing. So this is the 1600s, and Europe is rapidly coming out of feudalism and really into modernity, into the age of centralized nation states. The reason for this is gunpowder. Firearms were rapidly replacing knights on horseback as the dominant technology on the battlefield. And as a result, France is changing as well. France had always been a monarchy, at least going back nearly 1,000 years, but it had always been a relatively weak monarchy where the nobility was really in charge. And that's because the nobility were the ones who could field these knights and heavily armed men-at-arms to fight in wars. So you had all these dukes and marquises and counts who were quite independent and not only influenced the king, but dominated the king oftentimes. In her biography of Rochefoucauld, Mary Shelley writes, "In those days, nobles did not plot to become favorites of the king, but rather to rule over him." Okay, and that's often the case in kind of this time period in France. But everything is moving in a completely different direction towards centralized states with large standing armies directly controlled by that state and away from feudal arrangements because, if you can field a really large army with a lot of men with muskets, then that's going to be able to beat these armies with knights and men-at-arms that were kind of the old model. So the man who is dragging France into modernity, kicking and screaming, is a man known as Cardinal Richelieu. You might have heard of him. He is the bad guy in the Three Musketeers. And so the nobility really hate Richelieu, who was in fact a very intelligent and discerning man who did a lot to modernize France. So the nobility are constantly trying to block and challenge and overthrow him. And Rochefoucauld joins in these intrigues the second he is able to. As soon as he comes of age, he starts. And especially early on, these intrigues are sort of flailing and hopeless. Rochefoucauld is thrown into prison at the Bastille for 8 days. But the thing you have to know about this guy is that he is a classic swashbuckler, right? He's daring, he's brave, he's extremely capable, he's handsome, he's intelligent, he's charming. And so even his greatest enemy in later life, in writing a description of him, starts out by saying, quote, "There has always been a certain je ne sais quoi in Monsieur de la Rochefoucauld." And he ends by saying, "He might well have passed for the most polished courtier and the finest gentleman in private life, which this age has produced." And the guy who writes this of Rochefoucauld, his name is de Retz. And this is the guy who I mentioned at the beginning that Rochefoucauld kind of shuts him in a door and tries to have someone stab him from behind. Okay, so Rochefoucauld is so charming and talented that even his enemies, who he has tried to personally hand-to-hand assassinate, cannot fully resist his charms. So Richelieu, who Rochefoucauld plots against, lets him out of the Bastille after only 8 days, and he tries to convert him to the royalist side. He recognizes this is a talented and potent young man, and he wants to involve him in the future administration of France. And he's basically telling him, hey, don't throw your life away. Stop plotting against me. Come on our side. This is the direction France is going, and you should be involved in it. We'd love to have you involved in it. One of the main people who he plots with is Anne of Austria, the king's own wife. In fact, Rochefoucauld steals her away from the court because she is in opposition to her husband on a number of different matters and is very much friendly with the old nobility like Rochefoucauld is. He writes of this kind of adventure. He says, "However difficult and perilous this adventure might seem to me, I may say that never in all my life have I enjoyed anything so much. I was at an age, 24, at which one loves to do extravagant and startling things, and I felt that nothing could be more startling and more extravagant than to snatch at the same time the queen from the king, her husband, and from the Cardinal de Richelieu, who was so jealous." Okay, what an amazing adventure. So she's on his side. She's going along willingly with this kidnapping. She wants to go to kind of friendly territory. And, he's sneaking around through France. They're dressed up like commoners so they don't get noticed. He's going from safe house to safe house. It's an amazing adventure, the kind of thing that you would make a movie of. And frankly, I think an action like this justifies an entire lifetime. People will go their entire lives without living as much as Rochefoucauld did in a few short weeks when he is roughing it across France, dodging guards, and trying to whisk away the Queen of France. Okay, well, this plot fails, as do all his other plots. There is, however, one brief moment when it looks like he might be successful. Richelieu dies, and the nobles begin to fancy that, hey, maybe this is our opportunity to restore our power and return things to the way they were before. But an important rule for those of you who are trying to take over the world, things never go back to the way they were, all right? Like, things might swing back in your direction in some way, but they can never be just the way they were before. So if you've been listening to How to Take Over the World for a while, you know how important it is to have the best team around you. Great performers can give 100 or 1,000x returns on your investment. And that's why I'm incredibly proud that this episode is sponsored by the Austin Lab by Shockworks. They are the best in the business when it comes to creating AI processes and agents for your business. They have an incredible team of researchers and implementation specialists to hold your hand and make sure that you have a successful AI implementation, and they take a very consultative approach. And they have a ton of experience. They've got a global portfolio with over 150 successful implementations across the world with businesses of all sizes, from small to medium-sized businesses to huge enterprise implementations. They are a truly top-rate AI team, one that I would trust with any aspect of my business. And the best part of working with them is they only win if you win. They only make money if they save you money or grow your revenue. And they have a proven track record of doing exactly that. They can generate more than 40% cost savings and 30% efficiency gains, and they have done this, again, across hundreds of successful launches and implementations. So partner with the best. You won't regret it. Learn more at austinlab.ai. Again, that is Austin, as in the city Austin, Texas, austinlab.ai, and let them know that I sent you. And the problem with trying to make things the way they were before is that the way Cardinal Richelieu did things really works. And so his systems outlive him. Rochefoucauld writes about it this way. This is what he finds in Paris when he arrives after Richelieu's death. Quote, "I arrived at court and found it as submissive to his will after his death as during his life. His relations and his creatures continued to enjoy all the advantages they had gained through him. And by a turn of fortune, of which there are few examples, the king who hated him and desired his fall was obliged not only to conceal his sentiments, but even to authorize the disposition made by the cardinal in his will of the principal employments and most important places in his kingdom." Most painfully for Rochefoucauld, it's not only the king, but Queen Anne herself, who is now by and large in charge. This is his old partner in crime who he's tried to, whisk out of the country. She also goes along with this new regime kind of inspired by Richelieu and the way he was doing things. So her two sons are still too young to rule. And shortly after Richelieu, the king himself dies. So Queen Anne of Austria is now queen regent. And so she's totally in control. So this is Rochefoucauld's chance to make everything happen, to finally accomplish all the projects that they had been plotting. And yet now that she's in charge, she sees the wisdom of these reforms. And of course, now that she's the queen regent, the monarch in charge, centralization doesn't seem so bad, right? She's the one in charge of all these levers of power. So she turns on Rochefoucauld and adopts the policies of centralization advocated by Richelieu and now overseen by his successor, Cardinal Mazarin. Rochefoucauld considers this a betrayal and is one that he never gets over. Okay, by the way, really quick clarification, because I've thrown out so many names. So you have Francois de la Rochefoucauld, that's the guy we're talking about. Then you have Richelieu, that's the cardinal who really centralizes everything in France. And then his successors are Mazarin, Cardinal Mazarin, and de Retz. And de Retz is like the big enemy of Rochefoucauld. I know it's like a lot of French names, but hopefully that helps you get it straight a little bit. Okay. So Queen Anne of Austria turns on her old buddy Rochefoucauld. This doesn't stop him from plotting, of course. Nothing ever does. There's another small revolution called the Fronde, and Rochefoucauld is one of the preeminent supporters of it. And they're trying to prop up, the king has two sons, so they're trying to prop up one of the princes as the new king. They're still young, but they're teenagers, and so they're old enough to kind of be aware of what's happening and support one side or the other. So one of these princes supports the Fronde, and once again, Rochefoucauld has an adventure smuggling someone across France. This time, it's this little prince. And it is while he is fighting with this prince that he is fighting just outside of Paris, and he is shot by an arquebus, which is a form of early musket. He's shot in the face. And I'm not quite able to get like the biology of what happens. I've tried looking this up and no one's totally clear on it, but he gets shot in the face and this immediately blinds him. He can't see. And he's forced to retire to his estate where he rests and recovers over the course of a year. And over the course of that year, he does recover his sight. So I wonder if there were like some shards that got in his eyes and cut him up. But anyways, he's blind, but over the course of a year, he gains his sight again. Ultimately, with him sidelined and recovering, without Rochefoucauld's involvement, the Fronde fails and peace is restored under a powerful monarchy, the thing that they had been opposing. And look, all these efforts were ultimately doomed to fail. The 17th century was a time of transition from a feudal order to a powerful centralized nation-state-based system. And this was enabled by the firearm, and like nothing was going to change that. There's nothing, even if they had succeeded with the Fronde, it would have been short-lived, and they probably would have lost to, nearby nations who had adopted a centralized nation-state with large massed armies of firearms. So, there's nothing that he really could have done in the long term to be successful. But it is this sort of like beautiful, doomed last-ditch effort. I guess he just he doesn't want to accept the future. He wants to go down fighting for this thing that he loved. So yeah, you can think of Rochefoucauld's scheming and fighting as basically like the Western European chivalric version of The Last Samurai. Okay. And look, the actual policy issues at hand in the Fronde were extremely trivial for that reason. It was a war fought over small points of etiquette and little courtly favors. And that is because ultimately those are symbols of a changing order. Here's what biographer Edmund Goss writes about it. He says, the aims of La Rochefoucauld, in support of which he was ready to sacrifice his country, were of a class that must seem to us now petty in the extreme. He wanted the tabouret, the footstool for his duchess. In other words, the right to be seated in the presence of the members of the royal family. He wanted the privilege of driving into the courtyard of the Louvre without having to descend from his coach outside the walk-in. He demanded these honors because they were already possessed by the families of Rohan and the Bouillon. It is extraordinary to consider what powerful effects such trumpery causes could have, but it is a fact that the desolating and cruel wars of the Fronde largely depended upon jealousies of the Caresses and Tabouret, while Rochefoucauld's support of the rebellion frankly and openly was based upon it. So look, I think two things can be true at once. On the one hand, these changes were symbolic of power dynamics at court and a changing world order. And at the same time, Francois de la Rochefoucauld was extremely proud and vain and was willing to fight and kill and die and burn the world down for the privilege of being able to enter the palace without having to leave his coach and for the right of his girl to be able to sit with the members of the royal family. He is essentially a gangster. like he's a gangster, albeit, a very well-cultured and extremely well-mannered gangster, which is part of what makes his next act so interesting. So the Fronde has bankrupted him. He's poured a lot of money into this rebellion, which ultimately fails. And his first move is to get his fortune back by networking his way into some good business contracts and through clever business schemes, many of them hatched by his chief servant, the head of his household. And then he spends most of his time away from his estate in Paris in literary groups. He himself becomes the star writer of France at the time. He produces two great literary works, his memoirs and his Maxims. And of the two, the Maxims are by far the most famous and enduring. One of the reasons for doing this episode is that I noticed his name in all of the Coco Chanel biographies I read. His name pops up because she was a huge fan of his Maxims. And, as I mentioned in the introduction, they were also a huge inspiration on Nietzsche. And many great people, especially Frenchmen, have been fans of Rochefoucauld, including Napoleon, Voltaire, Talleyrand, and Joubert. So, what is this great work? What are his Maxims? Why has this captured the imagination of so many great figures throughout history? The primary theme is what Rochefoucauld calls self-love. We would probably call it self-interest. But the general idea is that everything is done out of self-interest. Okay, it's quite a cynical philosophy. So the first maxim is, what we term virtue is often but a mass of various actions and diverse interests which fortune or our own industry manage to arrange. And it is not always from valor or from chastity that men are brave and women chaste. Okay? In other words, his opening aphorism is that good behavior isn't always what it seems. People have ulterior motives. And this is something repeated very often. Another common theme is the general fickleness and untrustworthiness of human nature. For example, he writes, men are not only prone to forget benefits and injuries, they even hate those who have obliged them and cease to hate those who have injured them. The necessity of revenging an injury or of recompensing a benefit seems a slavery to which they are unwilling to submit. Okay, and this obviously comes at least partially from his experience in the Fronde and the betrayal he experienced from Anne of Austria. Amy Martin, another biographer, writes of this maxim, La Rochefoucauld is content to paint the age in which he lived. Here, the clemency spoken of is nothing more than an expression of the policy of Anne of Austria. Rochefoucauld had sacrificed all to her, even the favor of Cardinal Richelieu. But when she became regent, she bestowed her favors upon those she hated. Her friends were forgotten. And look, you can understand why he would feel that way. And there is a lot of that cynicism that you can just tell he has a bad taste in his mouth from these experiences. And it does honestly get tiresome, like maxim after maxim. You can't trust people. They're actually just serving their self-interest. They don't care about the virtues that they claim to espouse. They don't care about you. They only care about themselves. However, the maxims are worth working through because I think out of it emerges some really interesting thoughts. So much of like what we consider high-minded virtue and idealism is dragged through the mud, but interesting things come out on the other side. So what people call friendship is mostly just the expectation of some future benefit, right? What people call love is mostly just a match of convenience to advance their station. What people call virtue is mostly just self-flattery driven by weakness. However, like by removing the veneer of fake friendship, fake love, fake virtue, what you get at is the real, true, beautiful, pure thing. So for example, he writes of friends, of friendship. Most friends sicken us of friendship. Most devotees of devotion. Okay? That's incredibly harsh. Most friends sicken us of friendship. In other words, like most friends make us sour on the entire idea of friendship. Okay? It's an incredibly cynical thing to say about friendship. And yet, he also says, a true friend is the greatest of all goods, and that of which we think least of acquiring. So by kind of dissing on friendship, he's not saying that friendship is actually bad. The entire concept is fake and not worth it. No. What he's saying is, yes, most friendship is fake, and it's incredibly rare to find real friendship. But when you do, it's the most valuable thing of all. And so it's worth fighting through all that falsity and fakeness and pretense in order to get to the real thing, because the real thing is so valuable and so beautiful and so worth acquiring. He also writes very similarly of the idea of love. So he writes of love, there are some who never would have loved if they had not heard it spoken of. Okay? I love that. In other words, many people are just memed into love. It's something you do because you're supposed to do it. But, all these people, they never feel that natural, true, burning passion, that overwhelming desire that intoxicates you. But he's trying to dig through that self-deception and self-interest and that pretense in order to find real, true love. Okay, so he writes of love, if there is a pure love, exempt from the mixture of our other passions, it is that which is concealed at the bottom of the heart and of which even ourselves we are ignorant. So again, it's similar to friendship. Both are mostly fake, but when you find the real thing, it's worth trying to get to at the bottom of all these other passions because it's incredibly beautiful and worthwhile. So I think Rochefoucauld is uniquely situated to see through these pretenses because of his background. This is a guy who was like an alpha Chad, for lack of a better term, an apex predator. He was fighting, playing, scheming, seducing, competing. And frankly, so many so-called philosophers and scholars are really just building elaborate justifications for their own existence and justifications for why they are actually better and more virtuous than those who are richer, stronger, better looking, and more fortunate than they themselves are. This motivation occurs mostly on a subconscious level, so that I think, philosophers themselves are maybe not aware of the reason for what they do, but Rochefoucauld is able to see straight through this because he is the rich playboy aristocrat and therefore doesn't need to justify himself. He writes, quote, "The contempt of riches in philosophers was only a hidden desire to avenge their merit upon the injustice of fortune by despising the very goods of which fortune had deprived them. It was a secret to guard themselves against the degradation of poverty. It was a back way by which to arrive at that distinction which they could not gain by riches. Okay? And, I've known a lot of academics in my life, and I think there's a lot of truth. That's all I'll say. I think there's a lot of truth in what he said. Similarly, he writes of the weak and impotent who praise their own virtue. Quote, "No one should be praised for his goodness if he has not strength enough to be wicked. All other goodness is but too often an idleness or powerlessness of will." All right? And how many of us do this? Men who boast of their faithfulness when in truth, no woman would ever pursue them. Men who tut that power corrupts when they have never had any opportunity to have power anyway. So that is one of my top takeaways from the philosophy of Rochefoucauld. Be honest with yourself. Be painfully, brutally honest with yourself. Rudely honest. Make it hurt. To a point verging on cynicism, which is what he often did. You drag everything through the mud and view it in its worst light, not because cynicism itself is good, but because removing the veneer exposes the true beauty underneath. There's a pretty good example of this, I think, in the latest season of the HBO show White Lotus. There are these 3 women who go on vacation together, 3 blonde women, all in their 40s, who grew up together. And they're all smiling and pretending like everything is fine, when in reality, they're gossiping behind each other's backs, betraying each other, and there are all these fractures and differences between them that are exposed. Some of them are going after the same guy, and one of them hooks up with him. Okay. And so it gets so bad, there finally is a breaking point, huge blow up in the friend group. And for a while, it looks like the rest of the vacation is going to just be ruined. And then one of the friends gives this speech at breakfast. She says, quote, "I've just been so sad all week. I just feel like my expectations were too high, or I just feel like as you get older, you have to justify your life and your choices. And when I'm with you guys, it's just so transparent what my choices were and my mistakes. I have no belief system. Well, I've had a lot of them. Work was my religion for forever, but I definitely lost my belief there. And then I tried love, and that was just a painful religion, just made everything worse. And then even for me, just being a mother, that didn't save me either. But I had this epiphany today. I don't need religion or God to give my life meaning because time gives it meaning. We started this life together. We're going through it apart, but we're still together. And I look at you guys and it feels meaningful, and I can't explain it. But even when we're just sitting around the pool talking about whatever, it still feels very deep. I'm just happy to be at the table." Okay, so stripping away all those layers of fake friendship and fake connection, that we're such happy friends and we have so much in common, everything is great. By doing that, she's able to get to the bottom of what really makes their friendship, and that allows them to connect more deeply. I also think that sort of deep, self-aware honesty allows you to discover the truth about yourself, right? One of the first maxims that Rochefoucauld gives that influences everything else he writes about is our virtues are most frequently but vices disguised. And on the one hand, again, this could be interpreted very cynically. Oh, you're acting like you have this great virtue, but it's just a disguised vice. You're not really so virtuous after all. But I would also submit that this is just true. Let's look at this in a different context, okay? The book Make Something Wonderful has a great quote from Steve Jobs about something very similar. An interviewer asks him, "What do you think your weaknesses are when it comes to management?" And Steve responds, "I don't know. People are package deals. You take the good with the confused. In most cases, strengths and weaknesses are 2 sides of the same coin. A strength in one situation is a weakness in another. Yet often the person can't switch gears. It's a very subtle thing to talk about strengths and weaknesses because almost always they're the same thing. My strength probably is that I've always viewed technology from a liberal arts perspective." And he goes on. Okay. So first of all, let's just take a moment to recognize how great this is. An interviewer asks Steve Jobs what his greatest weaknesses are, and he says, "I don't know. Strengths and weaknesses are 2 sides of the same coin, but here are my strengths." So I think you should try this in your next interview. When someone asks you your biggest weakness, says, "Well, actually strengths and weaknesses are 2 sides of the same coin. So here's why I'm great, even more." But I think he's making the exact same point as Rochefoucauld. Your strengths and your weaknesses are 2 sides of the same coin. Your virtues are really just your vices in disguise. And I think this has 2 major implications. One, you need to be careful about addressing your weaknesses because you just might be risking the same thing that makes you great. If you eliminate this vice where the flip side is your great virtue, then that might not be a worthwhile trade-off to eliminate that vice. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you never address your weaknesses, but you do need to be very careful when you're doing so. Napoleon had this swashbuckling cavalryman, Murat, but he had a great line about him. Napoleon says, every army needs one Murat, but if it has two, one of them will need to be shot. Okay, so in other words, every army needs one crazy guy who will just charge into the enemy and attack no matter what. And this will inspire other men, but he's also somewhat chaotic. And if you have two of those guys, then that's too much chaos and you have to execute one of them. Okay, so obviously you can see that there, for this guy Murat, his strength and his weakness are the same thing. And so if you try to tell him, hey, rein it in, calm down, try being a little more obedient and level-headed, then, what would be the point of having a Murat in your army? His virtue is his vice disguised. The other big implication is that finding your weaknesses can help you find your strengths. Okay, let your shadow guide you. So many people are afraid of their vices, their foibles, the bad elements of their nature. But maybe, just maybe, you can let that guide you to success. For example, if you're ever with me at a dinner party and we get on the wrong topic, like I might corner you and go on for 20, 30 minutes, okay? That's a vice of mine. But of course, it's also what I do professionally. And so, like if I eliminated that from my nature, would I be as good of a podcaster? Probably not. So it's a counterintuitive thought, but what if you could find your greatest strength in your life, your biggest differentiator, by seeking out your biggest flaw and asking yourself, okay, what is the other side of the coin from this weakness? On that same note, he says, we do not despise all who have vices, but we do despise all who have not virtues. Okay, and I think that's very true. Ultimately, whether you have some vices is irrelevant. Everyone does. You will never become great by minimizing your vices down to nothing, right? Finding all your weaknesses and your foibles and just focusing on that until you're a completely polished stone and you have no weaknesses. That's not how it works. Rochefoucauld tells us you become great by having virtues, by having talents, skills, things you are great at. Okay, so I think that's an important point, that it's not the lack of vices that makes a person interesting and worthwhile. It is having great virtues. Just one more quote from Rochefoucauld that illustrates this same point. He says, moderation cannot claim the merit of opposing and overcoming ambition. They are never found together. Moderation is the languor and sloth of the soul. Ambition, its activity and heat. Okay, so like just being moderate and never kind of getting out of hand is not a path to a great soul. Okay, ambition is finding that element of your nature that is maybe prone to vice and a little wild, but has greatness within it. All right, some other great maxims from Rochefoucauld. He says, we have more strength than will, and it is often merely for an excuse we say things are impossible. All right, I love that. As Napoleon says, impossible is a word found only in the dictionary of fools. You must reject the entire idea of impossible. Speaking of Napoleon, Rochefoucauld also writes, fortune turns all things to the advantage of those on whom she smiles. Which reminds me, of course, of another Napoleon quote. He said, all great events hang by a single thread. The clever man takes advantage of everything, neglects nothing that may give him some added opportunity. The less clever man, by neglecting one thing, sometimes misses everything. All right, so again, the idea here, fortune or luck always smiles on you if you prepare for everything. Fortune favors the bold. You make yourself lucky through action, through vigilance, and as Napoleon says, by neglecting nothing. And then I'll wrap up with two more quotes. One is similar to an idea we've already talked about, but he says, it is only people who possess firmness who can possess true gentleness. In those who appear gentle, it is generally only weakness, which is readily converted into harshness. And that is very true. You will find no more harsh and cruel people than those who are truly weak and have just been waiting for their opportunity to flip it on others. And this is a similar idea to what we touched upon earlier, but so many people condemn the Napoleons and Caesars of the world, thinking that they are so much more virtuous because they would never commit such evil acts of violence, when in reality, they don't lack the harshness of a Napoleon or a Caesar, but only the power that they actually possessed. And in fact, if these people possessed even an ounce of the power of a Caesar, they would be much more cruel and less clement than someone, like Julius Caesar, for example. And then one last quote. This is one of my favorites. This is maybe my favorite Rochefoucauld quote. He says, we should gain more by letting the world see what we are than by trying to seem what we are not. And I think that is the ultimate insight of Francois de la Rochefoucauld. Be true to yourself. See yourself for who you really are with no pretenses, no illusions. Like, be harsh in your self-examination. And you will gain more by that exercise than by deceiving yourself. All right. And one last thing, I guess, about Rochefoucauld is he was able to have all these deep insights into human nature because he lived that full life. He was fighting, seducing, building, truly living. And that is what made him a great thinker and a great philosopher. And all these so-called philosophers who spend their lives locked in a room reading books and doing nothing else, they can't hold a candle to him. Like, he got to be the man, the swashbuckling pirate living a fun and happy life, and also the great philosopher. And ultimately, some of his critics never got to be either one. So if that is what you aspire to have great insights into the human condition, you can't forget to really live. It reminds me of a great poem called The Scholars by William Butler Yeats. Shout out to Eric Hewitt, who shared this with me. It's very short. It goes like this. Remember, this is called The Scholars. He's describing scholars. He says, bald heads, forgetful of their sins, old, learned, respectable bald heads, edit and annotate the lines that young men tossing on their beds rhymed out in love's despair. To flatter beauty's ignorant ear, they'll cough in the ink to the world's end, wear out the carpet with their shoes, earning respect, have no strange friend. If they have sinned, nobody knows. Lord, what would they say? Did their catalyst walk that way? I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I know this is a lesser known figure. Again, those of you who are here at the end of this episode, you're the real ones. You're the real fans. Thank you so much for the support and for bearing with me. I hope you learned something. I know I certainly did. Rochefoucauld was an extremely interesting person with an interesting philosophy and a beautiful life. And I think his philosophy is a much needed corrective to the positive thinking philosophy that pervades much of the world today and the self-deception that can come with that. So thanks for coming on this journey with me. And until next time, thank you for listening to How to Take Over the World. And of course, one last shout out to Speechify. I used Speechify to do my reading for this episode. 19th century translations of 17th century works of French literature are not the easiest to read and digest. And I find that listening while I read really helps me comprehend and retain more from my reading. Speechify is the best in the business at text-to-speech AI. And if you want, you can even listen in my voice. So go to speechify.com/Ben to get 15% off Speechify Premium. You won't regret it.